Well, good morning, Hawaii. Thanks so much for tuning in here. It is 10:30, which means it's time for Spotlight Hawaii. I'm Ryan Kalei-Suji, joined by Yunji Denise. Great to see so many of you already tuning in this morning. Yunji, we are joined this morning by a very special guest, someone that we are able to, we've had in the past and we usually are able to cover a lot of topics with our guests here today.
That's right. We're so lucky to be joined this morning by Senator Brian Schatz. He will spend the full half hour with us, and we're so happy to see all of you with us. Thank you so much for being here, Senator. We want to get straight to the funding, the American Rescue Plan. $2 trillion sounds like a lot, trickling down to $6 billion for Hawaii. What does that actually mean for the average person here in the state?
Well, it's going to be money for the unemployed. It's going to be money for a renewal of the PPP program. Tomorrow, the official announcement for the Shuttered venues grants program for our brothers and sisters and neighbors in the arts. Money for vaccine distribution, and maybe most importantly, in terms of a difference between this bill and the last year's relief efforts, is that there's money for the state and the county government to make their budgets whole and to prevent layoffs and furloughs, which I think would have lengthened the period during which we were still in an economic downturn. With this infusion of capital, I'm pretty confident that we can be back into an economic growth scenario by the third or the fourth quarter of this year. Obviously, our unemployment rate is going to continue to be our biggest challenge. We're probably 1, 2, or 3 in the nation in terms of the number of percentage of people unemployed. But this gives us a real chance to recover as long as we do the right things as it relates to the pandemic, especially vaccinations.
You know, there has been a lot of criticism on this bill, saying something that it was too large, that there was just too much money involved in this, with money, of course, going to the individuals who are currently struggling in unemployment, but also just the overall size and the support that it provides in all these different sectors. What is your response? Because I know that you're someone that has worked on this bill, that has advocated for it. What do you say to those who criticize that this bill as a whole is just too big?
Well, I guess I would just say that that's an argument I hear a lot in Washington and almost never in the state of Hawaii. Republicans, Democrats, independents, non-voters, small business people, students, the elderly. Nobody comes up to me and says, this bill is providing too much help during this pandemic. So I do think that's a kind of partisan framing that exists in Washington, but doesn't exist in a lot of people's home states. This bill is broadly popular across the board, across the political spectrum, because regular people understand that this is a one.
It looks like the senator's feed has frozen for a second, so we're gonna hopefully we'll get him back and up and running again. And let's see if that works.
Yep. I see him now.
Can you hear me now?
We can. Yes.
We can.
Okay. I have no idea.
So basically, please continue. Well, basically, please go ahead.
Well, I guess I would just say that, Secretary Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, they've all said the same thing, which is that there is much bigger of a risk of us doing too little than doing too much. And the reason is something called economic scarring. If we allow people to fall down economic holes, they will literally never be able to emerge from it, or at least it'll take 10 or 20 years, whether it's a small business or if it's an individual family. And so this bill, I think, learns the lesson of the 2008-2009 crash and does not err on the side of doing too little, and it errs on the side of doing too much. I think it's going to be the right amount, and GDP and economic growth measures are already improving, and all the projections are improving as well. So I think this is really key to our economic recovery.
How do we start to see that money actually making an impact? You mentioned that, by like Q3, 4, that we should be actually in a growth perspective, which is great to think about. But when do we actually see that hitting wallets, hitting bank accounts, what have you?
Well, the cash assistance is already hitting wallets and bank accounts, so that's really encouraging. I think most of the money in terms of cash assistance has already gone out. The unemployment assistance is already deployed, and so is the PPP money, as well as the shuttered venue money. But in terms of impact, I think the vaccination resources are the sort of highest bang for your buck. And Yunji and Ryan, we were all talking about this before the show started. I just continue to believe that our rate of economic recovery, our rate of societal recovery, whether it's just you wanting to visit your grandma or have a barbecue or hang out and sing karaoke or whatever it is, all depends on the rate at which we participate in vaccinations. We've actually been doing okay, but we're about to enter a new phase in terms of vaccinations, and that is we're going from there's not enough vaccines available, and so we got to prioritize, and all of that makes sense, to at some point in the next, I would say, 4 to 8 weeks, we're going to have so much vaccine that we're going to have to really reach out to folks who maybe they don't have internet access and therefore they have some difficulty signing up for the appointments. Maybe they're too busy. Maybe they're vaccine hesitant. Maybe they don't have transportation. But for whatever reason, they're not getting their vaccine. We're going to have to make sure that everybody that is eligible for a vaccine gets that vaccine, because all of us could do what we need to do. And if we're only at 55% of the public vaccinated, we're not going to reach herd immunity. And so I just think it's incumbent on all of us to talk about what a miracle of modern science and medicine this thing is. It really will save your life and bring the economy back.
Let's stay on that topic of vaccines, because we know initially that was a criticism by many that there was just not enough supply. We know that when the changeover in administrations happened between the Trump and Biden administration, there was a lot of talk of just the infrastructure that was not there and how the Biden administration had to set that up. Now that things are running, are you happy with the process in which here locally that vaccines are being distributed? Do you think there could be more? I just want to get your take on the processes of what the state of Hawaii is currently doing as compared to what you're hearing your colleagues are doing across the country.
Yeah, Hawaii is doing really well on vaccinations, and I criticized the state and the county governments when I thought it was appropriate and when I thought it was necessary during this pandemic because lives are at stake. But I think it's just a fact that we're doing pretty well. We're in the top 10, sometimes in the top 5, depending on the day, in terms of vaccine deployment. It differs by island. We're not done. It could get really hard, really quick. But right now we're doing reasonably well. And some of that is our health systems that, Queens and HPH have really stepped up. Kaiser, the Department of Defense, the Department of Health itself. So there's a lot of partnership that we can achieve because we're a small island state where we kind of all know each other, and we can just kind of, okay, who's going to rent the convention center? Who's going to get Pier 2? How are we going to cover all the ground? I think we're doing really well as it relates to vaccinations. But the thing that worries me the most is that the population that most wants the vaccines are the people who kind of were first in line. And so this next cohort is going to be some people who just weren't eligible, but also some people who were eligible from the beginning but still haven't gotten it. And that is going to take some persuasion. And I don't think it's like just a matter of running TV ads saying the vaccine is great. I think we really all have to talk to each other about what this thing is and what this thing is not. And what this thing is a miracle that will save your life. It truly is. It is way more effective than the flu vaccine in terms of the percentages. And it is 100% effective in preventing COVID death. So there's still a tiny little chance you'll get COVID, but there is no chance if you get vaccinated that you're going to die of COVID, statistically speaking. So it's really worth all of us repeating that as many times as we can because lives are at stake.
One of the things that we've been in discussion with the governor every time he comes on is this concept of vaccine passports. And, his basically he says that it's going to be very difficult to verify vaccines since, it's just basically a paper card. And so his concern with changing the Safe Travels program to allow people to bypass quarantine or bypass testing is that, there's just no way to prove that you're actually vaccinated. So he's really turning to the White House to kind of lead on that, saying that this should really be sort of a federal standard. What are you hearing about making some kind of a federal standard for vaccine verification? And, just what are your thoughts on that?
I think, I've been watching the White House press secretary talk about this, and I think they have a ton of reticence around a vaccine passport being originated by the federal government. That is going to cause a lot of people who are generally inclined to get the vaccine, but may lean towards a more libertarian view of the role of the federal government, to get very, very nervous about the federal government sort of creating a platform and a permission structure based on your health status, right? And you could see how that could go very, very wrong outside of the context of a pandemic. But there's another way to look at this, which is right now we require a negative PCR test to come into Hawaii and to be exempt from the quarantine requirements. That is a state executive order. That is a state requirement. There's nothing to say that we couldn't say you can either have a negative PCR test or a proof of vaccination. And I'll just point out that the negative PCR test thing is not some impossible to recreate via fraud document. Like I've had, multiple negative PCR tests. Sometimes they're literally an email from my provider. Sometimes, in fact, almost all the time, they're just an email, right? And so I don't think that it's any easier to commit fraud with the vaccine card than it is with the current PCR thing. And I guess I would just say, and I've continued to believe this before we started Safe Travels, look, if someone wants to come and be subject to the quarantine and then evade the quarantine, we don't have the law enforcement resources to go and chase everybody in their, purported house or hotel or wherever they say they're staying. And so just like the tax system, just like a lot of things that we do, it does depend on a person attesting to something. You could theoretically have somebody who's going to spend $700 come to Hawaii and print out a fake vaccine card, but that's a hell of a lot of trouble to go to commit a fraud rather than to just get a shot in the arm, which will save their life. I'm sure some, unwise person might do it, but I don't think that presents a big picture epidemiological risk.
One of the challenges right now that officials are having to weigh throughout the country, not only here in Hawaii, is the state of our economy as well as just keeping the public safe. And we have that debate continuing on now with our current numbers here on the island of Oahu, and that debate of whether or not Oahu should be moving back into Tier 2 or stay in Tier 3 with modifications that the mayor has just submitted to the governor. I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Currently Mayor Blangiardi saying that he does not think we need to move backwards, that he wants to keep everything the way that it is and make adjustments to that tier system. What are your thoughts with where we're at right now with some of the case numbers that we're seeing and what's open right now to help our economy continue to move forward?
The mayor is right here, and this is really important. When we established those tier systems, that was before, if I remember correctly, that was before the emergency use authorization, the first emergency use authorization for the first vaccine. So we established these tier systems, assuming that a certain number of cases would translate into a certain number of hospitalizations and a certain number of deaths. Those assumptions are wrong now because we have such a high percentage, not just of our overall population, but of our vulnerable population having been vaccinated. And so when you see a number like 50, it does not translate into the same number of deaths as it would have in a pre-vaccination scenario. And so I don't know exactly how to sort of recreate a new sort of algorithm to figure out what the new threshold should be. But I think it would be crazy for us not to acknowledge that we vaccinated something like 20 to 30% of our population and something like 60 to 70% of our vulnerable population. And so I agree with him. I think, look, if it were, in the 50s to 80s, that's one thing. If we ended up in the 2, 3, 4, 500, cases a day, I think that could still overwhelm our system and still cause lots of avoidable death. And so I don't think this is like an unlimited pass to do whatever we need to do. But I think it's just worth acknowledging that the tier system was established rather rigidly without an assumption that the vaccine would be available. And now that it's available, it's just smart to reevaluate it.
I want to ask you a little bit more about shuttered venues. And for our audience who might not be familiar with it, this is really a program that is designed to help theaters, music venues. One of the things, I just happened to be talking to Paula Akana, who's the CEO of Iolani Palace yesterday. A place like Iolani Palace right now, they're losing $80,000 a month because they relied so heavily on visitors. And because they don't have fixed seating, there's this requirement that you have to have fixed seating. They're not eligible for something like that. We also have Bill Comerford, who I'm sure your office has heard from. He owns 4 bars in Honolulu. He had 4 live music venues, but again, no fixed seating. How do we make sure that places like that, who sounds like should theoretically be eligible for this money, that they're not missed?
Yeah, so we've talked a lot with Paula about this. It is an unfortunate circumstance because the Shuttered Venues grant program is excellent. Anybody who depends on performance space, has really taken it in the chin economically over the last year or so. And so this program was established in order to help them get through it. And but the problem is, in order to avoid essentially making every attraction across the country, world's largest, grain silo, as you're driving across seriously, all of those attractions would have qualified if we didn't have this fixed seating requirement. And so with the fixed seating requirement, now Iolani Palace and some other really venerable institutions are not eligible. And so we've been trying to figure out a workaround. We have not found one yet. We're still working with Paula and the Friends of Iolani Palace to try to figure out what can be done. But I don't want to pretend we've come to a good place here. The law has been interpreted by a relatively friendly Treasury Department, and they're saying it's a no-go. So we're working very hard to figure out a workaround.
I want to switch gears here a little and talk more about money that was allocated for transportation issues. There's also the infrastructure bill or infrastructure proposal that the Biden administration has put forth. Want to get your thoughts on that, just the overall package. Some are saying that it is not really realistic. What are your thoughts on that moving forward? Well,
I think it's enormously important and something, now I've been in the Senate under 3 presidents, which is kind of shocking even to me. And every president wants to do infrastructure, and everybody on a bipartisan basis talks about our crumbling infrastructure, roads, transit, housing, sewer, drinking water, maritime port infrastructure, and the airports. And so we have an enormous opportunity to move forward on a bipartisan basis for infrastructure. Hawaii could benefit tremendously here, and we think we can do it in a way that is fully paid for, or at least mostly paid for. These are the kinds of investments that we will be glad we made 20 or 30, 40 years from now. And just one final point on this. This is an opportunity to do energy policy right, because a lot of what we have to do in terms of moving towards the electrification of transportation, and frankly, the electrification of everything, whether it's manufacturing or heating and cooling systems, whatever it may be, the more we can get everything onto an electric grid, the more we can move things towards renewables. But all of that depends on a high quality and modern grid, and that also takes money. So as we think about infrastructure, it's not just roads and bridges. It's also the modern infrastructure that we will be glad we invested in, when it's 50 years from now, because we're not going to be able to move forward with a clean energy future unless we have a grid that is, not from the 1940s.
One of the things that's supposed to be part of that clean energy future, of course, is rail. And Paul has a question here. What is your view of Honolulu's current rail status? Just for an update, I mean, the last time you were on here, we were talking about a $2 billion deficit. Lori Kahikina came on here and told us it was closer to 3, and now we're hearing 3.5. So will this infrastructure package, if it passed, be somewhat of a rail boost, even a rail bailout, or just to answer Paul's question, what do you think of the current status?
Let me answer your first question. It is highly, highly unlikely that the next infrastructure package could make up the shortfall. The shortfall is the shortfall, and we're trying to give Lori Kahikina enough space and time to develop a new financial plan, which she can present to all of the stakeholders. That includes obviously the city council and the mayor, myself and the rest of the congressional delegation, the legislature, the broader community, and then arguably most importantly, the FTA. Because we have a sort of a deficit of trust all the way around, right? I mean, the numbers that came out of Hart over many, many years were not trusted by the public. They were not trusted by any of the key legislative leaders, and also by our federal partners. And so I want to give Lori the space and time to develop a new plan, but I've tried to be as crisp as possible. My role here is in convening. My role here, in the last cycle, I was able to get them roughly $70 million to make up for the shortfall that was COVID related. But that doesn't deal with the structural problem that they're facing. And whether it's a $1 or $2 or $3 billion deficit, they're going to have to come up with a financing plan that doesn't just leave some giant X called, hopefully Schatz will find it. That's not going to work.
Want to also talk to you about just the overall climate of what we're seeing in Washington, D.C. Obviously, we know of what's happened on January 6th with the attacks on the Capitol. Recently, last week, there was another Capitol Police officer that lost their life when there was the other incidents, once again, with someone kind of breaking through the barriers there at the Capitol. What are you seeing and hearing about just the overall climate of where we're at with the safety of those like yourself who are in office, but also just the political climate of everything that's going on right now?
Well, look, I feel safe. I feel protected. That's the first thing. My heart breaks for the Capitol Police. And it's obviously true that at the leadership level, they made some pretty significant mistakes on January 6th. And I think that was addressed by a change in leadership and a bunch of reforms being proposed and hopefully implemented. But I just think it's worth saying that the Capitol Police have had just an awful time since the insurrection, and are working long hours and feel increasingly unsafe and underappreciated. And so I see them every day. They work so hard. They take great pride in protecting the United States Capitol, and they're feeling pretty much under siege. And so I think for my part, I think lowering the temperature on the partisan stuff is important. But I also think it is critically important that we do not forget that January 6th was an attack on democracy itself. This isn't some partisan dispute about voting rights or voter ID or whether you like Donald Trump or whether you like Joe Biden or whether you didn't vote or anything like that. This was an attack on democracy itself. This was an attack on the peaceful transition of power. And I don't think we should move on from that. And I do think there has to be reconciliation, sure, but reconciliation is only possible if there's accountability. And I think there has to be political accountability for those people who, for partisan purposes, decided to try to reject the results of an election and to cause their voters to believe that the thing was stolen. It was not stolen. You can have your disputes about the way, an election was administered, but to say that an election was stolen is to incite people to do things that are not just dangerous in the short run, but undermine democracy itself. And so I still actually am capable of moving on because it is my job to move on, but I actually actively cultivate that sense of outrage so that burning ember sort of never goes out. Because January 6th, they locked down the United States Senate floor and had us all walk very quickly in a single file line to an undisclosed location. That is not okay. And I'm not complaining for my safety. I'm talking about the safety of the American experiment. And so I think it is worth remembering how bad that was, how recent that was, and that we say we will never allow that to happen again.
We have a question here from Stephanie, and we always like to get to as many of these as possible. She says, I know you were critical about the handling of an outbreak of the virus last year at the Yukio Okutsu State Veterans Home in Hilo. Do you have any thoughts or comments about the new management that took over in January? We know a number of folks there lost their lives. That was earlier on in the pandemic, but let's see what you have to say for Stephanie.
Thank you for the question. A couple of things. We just got some federal funds for the Yukio Okutsu home, and so that'll help them to just do a better job. I don't know much about the management, and I, frankly, am not generally in the business of opining on the management of an individual facility like that. I only did it when I thought they were unacceptably slow last year, and so I generally would avoid evaluating how well they're operating the facility. There are generally accreditation institutions like JCO and CARF who would show up and take notes and go through a rigorous process. That's not my job. My instinct is to assume that everybody's always trying their best and doing competent work. And so I'm hopeful with the management change and the additional resources that we never have a situation like that again.
We have just a few more minutes left here, but I did want to provide you an opportunity to just have a chance to speak to our viewers, those watching here this morning. Any final thoughts that you would have and a message that you would have for those back home here in Hawaii?
Well, I guess the first, not to blow too much smoke, but I just think the two of you perform such an incredible service. Long form journalism, right? Really kind of digging in a I would call it lightly adversarial way. You challenge us, but not with like gotcha questions. I think it really does get information out to the general public. I just wanted to thank you for continuing to perform this service. And I just think people watch it for a reason. It's really a very effective platform. My final thought is this. Look, I think we can get through this. I am by disposition a super hopeful person, but I think a year ago the smart bet was always against things getting better. The smart bet was always that things were going to get worse, and now the economy is starting to percolate up. Kids are going back into school. Vaccine participation is increasing, and so I just would say it is okay to feel a little bit hopeful. That doesn't mean we all take our masks off and act dumb. But I do think that it's worth noting that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and it just depends on us kind of doing smart things for maybe the next 6 to 8 weeks. And I think if any state is positioned to like collaborate and work together and pull together, it's our state. So let's get through this next couple of months and finish this 2021 with a lot of joy, with a lot of prosperity, and a lot of safety.
Okay, Senator Brian Schatz, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We do appreciate all of your time.
Mahalo.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks.
Wonderful to hear from him. I thought it was very interesting that he backed the mayor on this decision on the tier alterations. He's saying that his thinking is really in line with Blangiardi's thinking, that when those calculations and those metrics were formed, we didn't have the vaccine as a factor. Now we do have it as a factor, and so that sort of changes the calculus. And then the other thing, you really heard him there advocating for the vaccine, saying that the faster we do this, obviously the faster we get back to normal.
Yeah, interesting to note. He's also saying that there might actually be an issue of having too much vaccines at some point and not enough people wanting them. One of his concerns is that the people that wanted them the most are those that were categorized in those initial phases of the rollout. And as we sort of move through this vaccination plan for the state of Hawaii, that many may actually end up those on the outsides who maybe have not been educated about it, may not know that it's their time yet, may not be taking it as seriously. And so his concern is that we may have too much available vaccine at some point. And so really to stress the importance of getting information out there and really, as he said, talking story with people in your community and sharing your experiences with it and how effective this can be overall.
Absolutely. The other thing that he talked about, of course, at the top of the broadcast was just the $1.9 trillion bill that was passed and how that's actually going to affect people on the ground here in Hawaii. The biggest difference between prior CARES Act funding and this, of course, is that it's helping state and local governments. So you see that the counties are getting money and the state of Hawaii is getting money. And that means that we're not going to have the furloughs that the governor had initially projected. That is a huge difference. You're not going to see teachers getting laid off. You're not going to see public workers getting laid off. So that makes a tremendous difference for the economic engine of our state. And also, to your question about just the size of this package and people who are critical of it, that there becomes this point where we go too far into debt and too far sort of out of economic participation, and it's so hard to climb back. And that's what justifies spending this kind of money.
Yeah, him saying that he's not hearing from anyone here locally saying it's too much money. We shouldn't have spent that much money. Most people are welcoming the support that they're getting right now through this package. And that's something that, of course, we've heard on this platform and through our programs many times from viewers who tune in. Also got his thoughts on rail and him saying that, hey, the plan of let's hope Schatz finds the money in transportation. Is something that they should not be relying on. And him saying that they're going to be waiting on the sort of giving Lori Kahikina and her team at Heart the opportunity to put together a plan and a budget moving forward now that they have taken the reins of this project that continues to see mounting costs that continue to go up.
Yeah, rail is something that we'll be talking about here for a long time. Another thing that obviously affects a lot of folks in our community is affordable housing and homelessness or houselessness. So we're going to be talking with Anton Krucky, who is the head of the Office of Housing and Homelessness for the City and County of Honolulu. He just took the helm there with the new administration. What is the new administration's plan? They had said from the start that they do not like the compassionate disruption model left over from the Caldwell administration, and they want to do things differently. What does that actually look like? We're going to be talking with him about that on Friday.
That's why I'm looking forward to that conversation. And we have a whole slew of guests as well next week, including Lieutenant Governor Josh Green. So we encourage all of you to continue to share this video. We thank all of you for your comments and for being a part of this conversation. Stay safe. Until then, we'll see you right back here on Friday. Aloha.
Aloha.